I'm Timothy Blauvelt. I'm professor of Soviet and post-Soviet studies here at Ilyas State University. It is my great pleasure to welcome here my friend and colleague, Professor Julie George from the City University of New York and Columbia University in New York City, to speak today about academic publishing in the social sciences. And Julie is on the editorial boards of a number of important journals, and also works as editor and assistant editor of several of the most important journals in our field of nationality studies and communist and post-communist studies. Is also on the board of Caucasus Survey and of, there's one more.
Problems of Post-Communism.
Problems of Post-Communism. Therefore, with further ado, it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Julie.
Thank you guys for having me, and thank you for all the work to get this together, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me. So I think there are more people taking photos of me than who are my audience people. So I'm talking to you, I'm talking to you, and I'm talking to you. Is that right? Are you my audience? And can you tell me if you are graduate students or professors here at ILIA?
Master level now.
Master level now?
Yeah.
And what's your field?
Philosophy.
Philosophy. And you? Historian.
I work here.
You work here.
I'm a student.
Okay, all right. And have any of you successfully published yet an academic journal? I see some nods. Okay. I just want to calibrate. So I have my presentation, and then, so it's all prepared, and we'll move forward. And it's got some tips and some advice, and then we can have a very robust question and answer if there are specific things that jog your mind, or if Tim wants to add, because Tim has extensive expertise on this issue as well. But I want to, oh, I've got to admit somebody. So I just want to make sure that I know the room. I don't need this. This is going to distract me. It's very nice machinery though. Okay, so most of my presentation is going to be geared towards academic publishing in the social sciences. In disclosure, I'm a political scientist, so there's a bit of a skew in terms of my subfield that may or may not directly link up with your experiences in your disciplines. But in general, this is meant to be kind of broad. And I want to start with the notion of the purpose of academic publishing, because I understand that, especially here at ILIA, there are pressures to publish in order to graduate, and then there are also pressures to publish in order to, in terms of what are expected in terms of the job requirements. And this pressure to publish can sometimes break our attention from kind of the overall purpose of publishing in academic journals, and that is to contribute to generalizable knowledge. And when I talk about contributing to generalizable knowledge, basically you're looking at two kinds of contribution. You're looking at a theoretical contribution, and you're looking at an empirical contribution, something about data. And not all publications have to have both theoretical and empirical knowledge, or contribute to theoretical and empirical knowledge. So just to kind of frame this out, sorry, the photographer is freaking me out here. I just kind of want to give you a sense of kind of common errors that people make when they contribute to journals. And I'm talking about errors that I tend to make, also errors that people from Georgia, from this region, tend to make when kind of presenting their work and presenting what they're doing. Journals, as you know, in the field, Tim mentioned that I am on the editorial board for Nationalities paper, or I'm a special issues editor, associate editor for Nationalities papers. I'm an associate editor for communist and post-communist studies, and I'm on the editorial board for Caucasus Survey and Problems of Post-Communism. These are 4 journals with very, very, very different focal points. They have very, very different emphases. And all of their emphases are kind of very much focused on the empirical experience of academic or scholarly interests inside the particular region. So Caucasus survey very much focused on events, history, economics, politics, culture, society inside the Caucasus, whereas problems of post-communism is a journal that is a policy-oriented journal that's very much focused on how things work here, how things work broadly within any of the post-communist states. So it has a much broader geographical reach than the Caucasus survey. Post-communist studies works with anything from Vietnam to China to Ukraine to Belarus to the Balkans. And so it also has a very large geographical reach. Nationalities papers is really focused on identity politics, politics of nationalism in the post-communist space, but kind of broader as well. And I mention all of these things because all of these journals are not giant theoretical journals in their fields. They're what we call niche journals or regionally focused journals that focus really on kind of the empirical experience of what it is to be in the particular region in those particular disciplinary areas. When you write an article for publication, you want to know where your contribution is quite accurately, because it helps you pitch it towards a particular journal. So when you write, I mean, obviously, as an academic and as a scholar, you want to write an article and get it in the best possible journal you can get into. And so generally in the hierarchy of academia, the best journals are the ones that are focusing on theoretical contributions as opposed to empirical contributions. None of the journals that I listed here are particularly theoretically oriented. So they're lower down on that hierarchy than the big journals in the fields. In political science, those big journals are British Political Science, American Political Science Association Journal, APSR, PRQ, not PRQ. Oh, thank you, Tim. I'm sorry. I'm not paying attention. Okay.
Turn off the waiting room.
Oh, no, let's not do that. Goodness knows what will happen if you turn off the waiting room. The Russians might come. But thank you. Just yell at me. It's a small enough audience that you can just interrupt me. Where was I? So like the big theoretical journals are the highest in the hierarchy, right? And so there's always the desire as a scholar to get in the journals that are most read, the journals where there's the most publishing, the journals where you have this largest contribution. But it's harder to get into those journals. The acceptance rate at, for example, World Politics, which is one of the top journals in my field, is something like 16%. So they only publish really 16% of the things that come to them. Just in comparison, nationalities papers, the acceptance rate is something like 40%. 5 years ago, it was 60%. So depending on the journal, like your chances of getting published are higher kind of the lower down that hierarchical status you go. And so what it means is at all times you're trying to modulate this desire for the larger audience with where the best fit is for your particular paper and your particular target area, with the understanding that those things may not come together, they may not reach some sort of, it's hard to have that equilibrium or that sweet spot where they're both speaking at the same time. I have this thing here to talk about the process of writing an article, which I don't think I'm going to speak much about, but it does speak to kind of where your research question is, how your research design works, where your data are, which journals are more likely to fit. Some journals focus on very empirical mathematical data, statistical outputs, especially for the economics journals. Some of the political science journals are sociological journals, and others are much more qualitative in nature and have things without the quantitative approach. You want to know what the specialty of that journal is so that your methodology kind of fits their logical, their typical, their typical audience. Their audience is used to reading particular kinds of things. And sometimes if you're writing for an audience that's just a little bit off. For example, I do what's called mixed methods in political science. So I do qualitative methodology, I do interviews, I do kind of rich, thick description work with white papers or newspapers or kind of archival things, but then I also do statistical work as well. When I publish in a journal that is predominantly qualitative, I take very care on how I present my empirical work because I know that the audience is not used to reading the jargon. They're not used to understanding those materials. So the more you know the audience of the journal, then you know how to package your material so it fits that audience. Sometimes we get caught in our own jargon and we don't know how it's understood or read by others. And jargon is always confusing and it's always isolating. And so when you're publishing, you want to know what jargon your audience will have available to them. So if you want to introduce them to some new thinking or you're using a methodology that they're not used to, you can better package it. And what that does is it gives you more momentum in the review process. You always want to know whether your contribution is theoretical or empirical. Sometimes one of the things that catches authors up in review is if they declare that their contribution is more than what it is. And so if your contribution is empirical, like this is what this works like in Georgia, and I can see it here in Brazil, but this is what it is in Georgia, then that's an empirical contribution. It's not a theoretical contribution. So you couch it in those terms, and therefore your contribution assessment is kind of in line with your reality. All right, so I'm going to move forward. Now, I've learned some things in being on these editorial boards, and especially in being an associate editor, and as someone who also writes and publishes. There are the activities that correspond with publishing, and then they're what they really are behind the scenes. And I've also noted that I keep an eye out for Georgian scholars in particular because I have an affinity for Georgia, and I can see some common errors or common, not errors, maybe practices that some Georgian scholars have, especially Georgian students, that I kind of want to make you aware of so you can see kind of how those go. So basically it goes like this. You write an article. You submit it to an editor and to a journal. It goes through the peer review process, which is anonymized, so the reviewers don't know who you are, and you're never aware of who the reviewers are. Those reviews come back to the editors make a decision, and then the scholars reach a decision as to what that decision is. And there are a variety of decisions that we can get to, but that's in my next slide, so I'm not going to go there yet. But let's talk about what it means to actually do this sort of thing. The first thing is if you are writing, and kind of mentioned before, you want to have a very good sense of the strengths and weaknesses of your article. We all think it is stronger than it actually is, probably. At least that's my experience. When I write it, I think it's the most brilliant thing in the world, and then I get my reviews back and I read them, and I am first very upset, and then I read them again, and then by the 5th time I read them, I'm like, oh yeah, they're totally right. Why did I ever send this out for review? I'm so ashamed. They should have never had to read this article. That's my internal process. You want to know the strengths and the weaknesses of your article, in part because you can address a lot of the problems in your article that the reviewers find in the article itself. And so if you are reflective of that and you are aware of that and have that self-awareness, what it does is it undercuts the critique that they offer. And so then they'll say something like, well, the scholar makes this error, but they reflect on it, and this is the outcome. And if the reviewer can't figure out a way to overcome it, it makes it less of a reason to reject the article because the article then is kind of in its silo, it's narrowed down to what it can do, and the reviewer says, okay, well, maybe there's a way to fix this, and then they can give you some really good feedback about how to fix a problem that you've already observed. Or if you can't fix it, then there's not much to do with the critique except to say maybe the findings aren't big enough for this journal, maybe you should send it to a different journal and send it to Caucus, a survey. You want to know what kind of contribution you're making. theoretical contributions are very, very hard to make because there's so many theories about everything, and there's so much that has been discovered. So oftentimes people are couching something in some particular theoretical focus. I've noticed that articles that come from this region, like Caucasus, but also post-communist regions, often will take a theoretical tool, like Foucault's vision or something, and then apply it. Like, we're going to use this lens to explore this thing in Georgia, or this thing in the region, or this thing writ large. But often it's about regional politics, Georgian politics, if it's coming from Georgia often. And that's a much more narrower contribution. And so when you're using that strategy for publication, you want to make sure that you clarify why this lens is a contribution, why it is showing something new that we don't understand about Georgian politics. Like, before we used this lens, we had a misunderstanding. Oftentimes that reflection is not in an article, and it's up to the reviewers to try to figure it out and tease it out of the author, which is sometimes a reason for rejection. So you want to know the functional contribution, and you want to know it accurately, but you also want to make sure that it's concrete inside the article. Lately, and maybe this is only in political science, and since you guys are not political scientists, this might be irrelevant for you. Probably you have heard that Georgian politics today is very polarized. You may have a sense that there's Kotuliots Neba, and then there's UNM, and they hate each other. A lot of articles that we're getting now in the journals are fighting those wars. And so we'll get something that's all about how Otsnaba is terrible, but it won't be Otsnaba is terrible. It's like, why Saakashvili's approach is more Western, or it'll be very critical of Saakashvili and UNM, the state capture and prison of UNM, and now Otsnaba is the answer or something. So there's a soft partisanship that we're getting in a lot of Georgian articles, like a lot of them, especially in the policy journal Problems of Post-Communism. The journal cannot publish those. They will always get rejected. And it's very hard. There may be a kernel of theoretical interest. There may be a kernel of empirical knowledge in there. And so the editor has to figure out whether that author can move from the politics of it and the partisanship of it into that nonpartisan scholarly approach. And it's a source of a lot of rejections that we do because we cannot publish those kinds of things. So if you in your writing are motivated by something that you see wrong in Georgian society, you want to take a very, very hard look at it to make sure it is fundamentally nonpartisan. It may have implications, but those implications should never be articulated in the piece. It's not an opinion piece, right? It's a scholarly piece. And it's easy for me to say as an American, right? Like, it's so easy, and Americans make the same mistake with Donald Trump, because Trump, it's like, we are also polarized. We also have a hard time writing about these politics concretely, and it's something that we also have to police ourselves for. So I want to say that with full recognition that it is something, it's a challenge that we also share in the US, because we have similarly polarized politics. If you are writing a piece that's non-theoretical, which is probably 75% of the stuff that I see, it falls into this. This is an example of something, or this is an empirical thing. This is what is happening in Georgia over time. The fact of the matter is Georgia, as fabulous as it is not particularly interesting at the scholarly level. Like, not many people are interested in Georgia. They should be, obviously, it's fabulous. But very few people go to read an article about Georgia. Rather, people are looking for what Georgia is example of. Like, Georgia is a very interesting example of this, like, for linguists, it's obviously, one of the central languages to write about, because it is emblematic of some linguistic problems. in terms of economic development. It's very interesting. Why? Because of the challenges of the transformation of the economy, because of the challenges of the oligarchies, because of the challenges of natural resources and the struggle of environmentalism versus development, right? So in those cases, Georgia is an example of something bigger, especially if you're writing on Georgia, Georgian anything, you always have a better shot at getting published if you can showcase why it's a good example of something, of a broader generalizable concept. And I'm reminded of my title here. The purpose is to contribute to generalizable knowledge, not specific knowledge, to generalizable knowledge. So the more that you can put your writing in this context of it being an example of something else or part of something bigger, then you're speaking to a much broader literature, a much broader debate in whatever discipline you find yourself to be in. In terms of just, I don't have a slide on this, but it strikes me, in terms of mechanics, you want to make sure that your organization, the organization of your piece, matches templates that you find in that journal. You want to make sure that your sections are part of a kind of general structure for whatever discipline you're writing in. What you think is right may not be, like what is intuitively a good organization structure for you might not be what is normal in that journal. So if you find yourself kind of, once you decide which journal or journals you want to try to send your article to, I would spend some time looking at articles in that journal, preferably not on the topic that you're writing on, because if it's on the topic you're writing on, you're going to get distracted by the text and the substance. Find something that's not on anything that you work on at all and just observe the structure of the piece, how the introduction is, how short it is, how long it is, what kind of keywords they use. Is there an abstract? What is in the abstract? What are the sections and the subsections? How does it flow? And get a sense of how the journal's template works. With different disciplines, there'll be different templates. In the social sciences, we have a very rigid sort of template. In the sociology, econ, political science, we all share that, but it's different than history or anthropology. So you want to, in your discipline, kind of see how those tend to flow and see how your piece corresponds or doesn't correspond with that, that mechanic. All right, when you submit to the editors, you always want to follow the instructions on the interface, and it's probably going to be on Manuscript Central or Scholar One or one of Scholastica or one of these kind of interfaces. You want to take your if you're working in Word or in Adobe or with PDF, you want to make sure that your identity is outside of the what is it called, Tim? What is it called? Properties. The properties section in the thing, because sometimes your reviewer can click over and see it depending on the process and which system it is, and you don't want them to do that. You want to follow the instructions. In some fields, there's a cover letter that corresponds with it, but in my journals, we don't pay any attention to those cover letters, so don't feel pressured about the cover letter to sell it. I think that's really a thing in the sciences. I haven't seen it much in the social sciences. I would certainly never pay attention to a cover letter. Like, I just skip to the article. Reviewers these days are absolutely impossible to find. From my perspective as an editor, they're all working for free. They're all volunteers. They've all experienced the pandemic, and now they're all experiencing, especially in our region, they're all in the throes of the Ukraine war, which is very, as we all know, I mean, it's very destabilizing for everybody who works on this part of the world, in this part of the world. And so it can take a really long time to find reviewers. The more specific your topic is, the harder it is for them to find reviewers. The more esoteric your methodology is, the harder it is for them to find reviewers. What will happen is your thing will go under review, and it might take a month for your editor to find a reviewer, because a lot of people are saying no these days. If you don't hear anything for 2 months, it's absolutely fine to email the editor. After 2 months, if you haven't heard, You can send an email and say, hey, be nice, you know, because they're working for essentially free as well. The editors don't get paid very much. You know, my stuff has been under review. I haven't heard anything back. Can you give me a sense of it? And if they have a heavy workload, it can sometimes, they can lose it. And so a reminder from time to time is not a bad strategy. So you should feel comfortable doing that. Just be very, very nice to them, because they're all very overworked people and they're underpaid. Even in the West, even in that context, they're underpaid. So your reviewers are all volunteers, but when you get your response back, they don't have to be particularly nice. And some of them are really not nice people, and they're not really nice in terms of constructive criticism. And that can be very traumatic. And I mean, the only thing you can do is just ignore it. I ignore it. What's funny is, I presume, with the exception of Tim, everyone here, your native language is Georgian. And sometimes the reviewer will come back and say, the English is terrible. This is obviously written by a non-native speaker. And if that ever happens to you, don't worry about it, because the reviewers say the same things about native speakers. So I have sent, like, you know, English native speaker sent it out, and I get a review back. It's like, oh, well, they need to work on their English. This is terrible. And, you know, you can't say, actually, you know, they live in Kansas. No. So just ignore all of that. It happens to everybody. One of my friends who publishes all the time, he got a review back and said, this looks like it was written by an undergraduate. This is terrible writing, you know. And you know, he's in a full professor chair in his department. So just ignore all of that. Put it, like, set it aside. Just take it out of your head and set it aside. Don't worry about any of that stuff. Some people are just jerks, and that's what that is. What you're more likely to see is that one person will write and say, oh my gosh, the literature review is fabulous. They cite all the right things, but their data are terrible. You need to redo all of your data work. And then the other reviewer will say, oh, the data's great, the data's fine, but this literature review is garbage. They haven't cited these 40,000 people. And so then you get to the point where you have a word limit. So you can't go cite all the people that reviewer wants you to do. And you also now have to fix your empirics for the other reviewers, so they might be contradictory. Or one will say, well, the best way to do this is go down and do X, and the other person will say, by all means, don't do X, do Y instead, right? Which gives you entirely contradictory advice. There are 3 ways to deal with this problem. The first way to deal with this problem is pay attention to what the editor says. When the editors decide, I don't think I have anything. Oh yeah, so the editors, here we go. The editors will help you navigate this sort of thing. So a good editor will read those reviews and anticipate your trouble. When I give advice back, so I'll get reviews, and one of them will be like, oh, this is terrible, and the other one will be like, this is great. I'll say something like, I really like reviewer 2's suggestions for X, Y, Z. And what that means is the editor is aware of this contradiction. The editors are not controlled by the reviewers. I think this is an error that many people in the scholarly process think, that the reviewers say yes or no, and the editors say, well, 2 said no and 1 said yes, so I have to reject. That's not the way it works. The editor reads the reviews and makes a decision, and has a lot of leeway on that decision. And so if the editor looks at the article and says, there's something here, but you know, this one's saying to do this one's saying to do this, I think it's better for them to do this, they will suggest that in their response to you. But here's the thing, all the reviewers get that response, and no reviewer will review for a journal again if the editor says, ignore reviewer 1, just pay attention to reviewer 2. So what the editor does is very gently in the text say, reviewer 1, reviewer 2 both give excellent feedback, but on the point of empirics or on the point of methodology, reviewer 2's advice, we really recommend you look at reviewer 2's advice. So there's an undertone, there's a subtext in that message. So it might be hard for you actually to understand, especially since your native language is Georgian, you guys speak and write in like all these different languages. It's amazing. So you want to read for that subtext. If the editor doesn't give you that subtext, then you should, and you're not sure what to do, you're absolutely within, it is totally normal to email the editor to say something like, my reviewer 1 said this, my reviewer 2 said this, I've got to revise and resubmit. These are contradictory pieces of advice. Can you recommend, and you want to kind of say, I'm tempted to go in this direction. Do you think that would be appropriate? And then the editor will feel in that email exchange to be more open to doing this sort of thing. Another way, so that's number one, to look for the editorial advice on resolving that contradiction. The other way to do it is to seize it in your own trajectory. So you get the advice, and some of the advice you're like, oh, this is great advice, I should take that advice. And then others' advice is like, this is stupid advice, who would tell me to do this? It's absolutely wrong. That's not what I want to do. That's not the direction I want to take it in. You take it in the direction you want to take it, you revise it, and you prepare a memo. And in that memo, you say, reviewer 1 suggested X, reviewer reviewer 2 suggested Y. These actually are exclusive things. I went with reviewer 1 because, and then you make an argument in that memo. A very carefully crafted memo is the path for taking something that's a revise and resubmit and actually getting it published. So that memo is critical. I said there were 3 ways. But really, there are only 2. those are only the 2 paths forward. The other path is just to ignore it. But the reviewer will pull up their old review and they'll say, "Oh my gosh, you ignored my advice." And they will get offended because they've spent all this time reviewing your work. I typically lay it on a bit thick in my memos. You know, reviewer 1 and reviewer 2 are obviously the most brilliant people in the world, and they have all of this sage and constructive advice, and I'm really appreciative of it. And yet, reviewer 2 is obviously the right one and reviewer 1 is the wrong one, or vice versa. Tim has a whole theory about reviewer 2, right? Tim, that you think reviewer 2 is the evil reviewer and reviewer 1 is the good.
Not just me, it's a whole Facebook group.
Yeah. Like, I've actually thought a lot about that when I pick my reviewers, like which one's 1 and which one's 2. And I can give some insights into why that's both wrong and right, but I'll come back to that later. So there's a lot of information in that editorial feedback that you get, not just that review feedback. So you want to pay attention to that. All right, so the editors decide. I forgot where I am. Editors decide, and then the scholars receive the decision, and the decisions can be this. 1, you get an acceptance. It's a brilliant article, first time out. This never happens, by the way, but maybe it happens, or you could get a conditional accept, which is, we'll publish this thing. It's not going back out for review. You fix X, Y, and Z conditionally, and then we'll publish it. And that's really, a conditional accept is a great outcome because it means that there's no time delay. The editor is the one that reviews the changes. For a conditional accept, the better your memo to say, okay, the reviewer said to do this, the editor said to do this, this is exactly what I did. It makes it easier for the editor to double check to make sure that's what was done. And so then they can just read the memo and not spend so much time on the full text of the article. There is power in the memo. So I should have had another thing on conditional accept. You want to do the memo. If you get a revise and resubmit, that means that the article has all of the pieces together. They're just not working together particularly well. And that the editor considers the author able to revise that piece so it can be published. There are minor R&Rs. This is the revise and resubmit is an R&R, and then there are major R&Rs. If you get a minor R&R, you don't really have to reevaluate that much. If you get a major R&R, it's a signal. It's saying, like, there are some big gaps in this piece, but we can see a glimmer of hope in it, but not more than a glimmer. A glimmer of hope is there. So if you really radically change things you should be able to publish it. So that's the difference between a minor and a major R&R. Minor R&R is, okay, you got to fix these empirics a little, like your lit review is a little bit shaky, and your theoretical contribution, I don't know what it is, but there's something there, so you figure it out and you write it. That's still a lot of work, but the editor can see that it's 70% done. Now, it's hard when you write it, you submit it, you think it's 100% done. You probably think it's 200% done. And you get it back, and a minor R&R is like, this thing is 70% there. And so that can be, even that can be a setback just psychologically. So you want to be able to kind of move beyond that. A major R&R says it's like 40% there, and you really need to think about it. A major R&R requires you to think outside whatever your comfort zone is. It may be that your theory is problematic, so you need a new theory. It could be that your empirics are wrong, or your empirics are skewed, or you need more empirics. So it is a signal that there's a lot more work to be done on it, and you want to take that as it is. Like, you don't want to treat something that's a major R&R like a minor R&R, because you're less likely to get it published. You're less likely to get that acceptance in the end. So you want to take a minute, if you get a major R&R, and really think about what those reviewers are asking for, and how you can answer it. So there's a lot, you'll notice, it is a hard work sort of thing. A reject and resubmit is something that we're doing now with, I don't know if we have this. Different journals will have different options for these things. So the conditional versus the accept versus the minor versus the major versus a reject and resubmit versus a reject. We're expanding out the review responses. And a reject and resubmit it reflects the editor's and the reviewer's consensus that the author probably can't fix the things that are wrong with the article. We've been doing a lot of reject and resubmits for some of these articles, and at least in the political world on Georgia, that are so focused on the polarization and so focused on the partisanship that they lose that other thing. And so you think to yourself, well, if they were able to just set all that aside, this is a great article, like they could actually publish it. But then the question is, well, can this author do that? Can they set it aside? And we don't know the authors, of course. I mean, maybe we do, but typically we don't. Like if Tim sent an article to my journal, I would have to give it to somebody else because we have a professional and friendship relationship. So it would go, I would just send it to a different editor. So we don't know if that person has that capacity, but we hope that they do. So a reject and resubmit implies that. If you get a reject and resubmit, though, you have that glimmer of hope, but it means that there's a lot of stuff you need to let go and really, really, really rethink and be very hard on yourself. That's when you send it to your hardest critic, preferably who isn't here. Like someone in an entirely different context, your Brazilian friend that studies economics or something. Someone who's in academia, but someone who's not, who has that broader capacity that the journal editors have to bring. Yes, Tim?
I have another theory. Maybe you could tell me if there's any truth in this.
All right.
And that is sometimes editors or journalists would use reject and resubmit, where otherwise they might use revise and resubmit, because that improves the rejection rate of the journal, which would improve their statistics.
No, not at my journals, not at mine. Paul does not do that.
Higher rejection rate sort of more selectively.
No. There are other strategies, but no. That's what we're looking at in terms of statistics is our citations and where we are on the H index, and most of that has to do with article quality, but it's not messing with the statistics. In fact, the statistics that we're most concerned about is time to publication from submission, which puts a lot of pressure on me because I procrastinate.
But when you revise and resubmit, when they submit again, that gives a new...
No, it keeps it, a reject and resubmit would be an entirely new submission. You're correct. So we have it would improve. It would lower the acceptance rate statistically, but. Yeah, but we wouldn't. I mean, that's just dishonest. No, like I don't. Oh yeah, Tim. Yeah, the people on the Zoom didn't hear your call. Oh, sorry. So Tim is asking. I'll just clarify. So Tim is asking whether or not we do a reject and resubmit instead of a revise and resubmit to increase our statistics to make it look like we're a much more selective journal. No, in fact, nationalities papers recently, like last year, our acceptance rate was 30%, and now it's back up to 40%. And we like that. We like that 40% sweet spot. We're not trying to get down to 30. And so I mean, I can see why you're thinking that, but I'm the one who's in charge of, like, when they come to me, I can say this is a reject and resubmit. And if that's where the reviewers are, but there's no discussion on the editorial board meetings of like how to juke the stats. This isn't The Wire, Tim, but I can see where your mind is going there. No, it's actually not that diabolical. A reject and resubmit is actually a message that we see hope in the paper, that we could imagine the journal publishing the paper, but where that paper would need to be and where it currently is about this distant. And we're not sure the author can do it. When we reject, it's that there's no way this thing can ever get there. But a reject and resubmit is a message to the author saying, actually, there is hope in this piece. We're just not sure you can get there. And a lot of the editorial process is guessing as to what the author's capacity is to kind of bring it up. If you get a rejection, you want to reevaluate it and understand why that rejection happened. Sometimes the rejection happens because it doesn't fit the journal, and it doesn't work with the journal. So that the paper might be totally good, but upon review, we realize that it's just not a right fit for the journal. And in that case, you can kind of resend it to the journal, to a different journal. So that sometimes it's a matter of fit. Often there's something wrong with it. Typically what's wrong with it is in the theory or in the empirics. It's theory, empirics, and journal hierarchy. Like, so a very well-ranked journal might say, okay, there's something wrong with the theory, there's something wrong with the empirics, and it's just not worth our time because we have so many other submissions, we don't need this piece. Whereas a lower tier journal might say something like, the empirics, there's a problem, the theory, there's a problem, but, we can see that there's a place for it, so they might not reject. So sometimes that rejection is a relationship between the theory, the empirics, and the fit, and the hierarchy. So it's kind of one combination of those four things. You want to know what your problem is. Typically, at the journals where I publish, where I'm on the editorial team, in nationalities papers, this is just something I've observed over time, is that if the empirics are good, if the data are interesting, if they're fresh, if they're new, if they're a new contribution, we really want those data out, and we want it to be affiliated with a journal. And sometimes the theory will be all a mess, the literature will be problematic, the fit, the writing, even the writing, but if there is a kernel of good, interesting empirics that are new and fresh, we will invest more in that article than if it's a whole bunch of fancy theory with the empirics aren't that interesting. We're much more likely to reject the fancy theory one if the empirics aren't there. So you want to look at your piece and say, okay, what is it? I mean, it's kind of like salesmanship, like you're kind of marketing yourself and your work. It's like, what is it here that is of most value? Typically, it's not the theoretical contribution or the new lens or this discourse or whatever. Typically, this is the information that I am packaging in a systematic way to make this contribution. And so I think that's the kernel of the difference between a revise and resubmit and a reject and resubmit and a total reject, is that kernel of empirical work. Keep in mind, if you get a rejection and you probably have this piece and you're gonna send it out to a new journal, and maybe you're just gonna go down your hierarchical line, which is normal, your reviewers might be the same. So there are articles that I get because of my area of expertise, that I can see the same piece come to me like 5 times. I've reviewed the same article like 4 times, and at different journals. And at some point, I tell the editor, I'm like, I have rejected this piece so many times, like, give it to somebody else because I am now biased against this piece. Like I can't be unbiased anymore because I've seen it. What you want to do, the way to game that trajectory, is make sure you pay attention to the reviews, right? So you get these reviews, this article's terrible, you got to rewrite the literature review, you got to cite so-and-so. Read those reviews and try to take the best, most concrete, best criticism and at least revise it once. At least cite the people who they say you need to cite, it might be them. So that when they get it again, they know that you've paid attention to their work, that you've paid attention to their review, because it is likely to go to the same reviewers, because these things are so specialized. Like there are only like 6 people who can review this piece, whatever it is. And it's going to go to one of those 6. And chances are you've got a high probability that they've already read your work and rejected it. So you want to make sure you've got to win them over again anyway. When there is pressure to publish, and this is something that's happened with a lot of scholars from the region, not just the region. I don't know if Americans do this as much as Europeans do. Let me just put it that way. Recently, the editor will send the rejection out, and then the editor will receive a very long, angry email from the author talking about how they're terrible, how the reviewers are out to get them, the reviewers don't know what they're talking about. And it's increasing. And I think, I understand here at ILIA, there are requirements for PhD students in order to graduate to publish in an academic journal. And what that does is it creates this pressure to publish and this desperation, I think. And there needs to be a way to kind of navigate this. Do not send an angry email to an editor, ever, 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 ever. If you need to write it, by all means write it. Just don't send. Get it out. Get it out of your system, write it, do what you need to do, but never, ever send it. The way to respond, like the other thing, I mean, some people say they want feedback. So they'll say, well, I need to talk to the reviewers so that they can provide me better guidance so I can rewrite this article. The reviewers are unpaid. They are paid to mentor graduate students and colleagues, that they're already doing that. They don't have time to do it for the people for whom they write reviews. So you also don't want to demand more. We had one that filtered back to me where someone was like, I need that concrete feedback. No. What you could do is make an argument for a third reviewer. So some people do that. Some people will say, so for all of my journals, it goes to 2 reviewers. In some journals, it goes to 3 reviewers. It depends on the journal. Most journals, it goes to 2 reviewers. And sometimes the reviewers are in disagreement. Sometimes they're in agreement. And sometimes the author will request a third reviewer. You're more likely to get it if you explain why you need a third reviewer. We've had people who, we send an article out for review. Let's say it's a cultural sociological paper, and we send it, and we try to find people in that discipline. So we try to find people in the discipline and with the empirical knowledge. So if I get an article about Georgian politics, for example, I will try to send it to someone who knows that component of political science in the region, and I'll also try to send it to someone who is ethnically Georgian. I'm more and more to kind of decolonize the review process. And so this is a concerted effort that we're making, especially in international journals, to pay attention to not be like these Americans judging these other people. I mean, it's horrible. And so there is a concerted effort made to make sure that the reviewers will be both fair and knowledgeable. about the area. And have time. It's hard finding people to do Ukraine these days because you're sending it to people who are being bombed, so that's another challenge, but here it's less of an issue. But so I had an author who wrote a piece, something sociological, cultural, sociological, and I sent it to one of the top cultural sociologists in the world, like who dealt with this particular area, and the person rejected the article or gave it a very hard R&R, I forget, and the author wrote back saying, well, I need you to send it to a cultural sociologist. And we kind of had, like, as an editor, you can't say, well, we did. Like, the problem isn't our reviewer. Our problem is the author. You don't want to be that author. You want to be the author that's mindful of where that is, where that critique is, and to be able to see the critique. It is very hard to get critique of your own work. It's easy to reject the reviewers. I find that sometimes, since I'm on these editorial boards, what the editor might do is reach out to a member of their editorial board and say, hey, I've got two reviewers that are, like, the author is not sure. Maybe often it's methodological, often it's about statistics or whatever, and the reviewers don't know the methodology as well, and they want another person who understands the stats or the region or something. And so often there's someone on the editorial board that can look it over and see where it is. But when you do that, you ask politely, and you ask with reason. Like, you need to have a concerted reason. Not these reviewers are idiots and don't know what they're talking about, or they would recognize my brilliance. That's not the way to go. It's, I made this particular argument and the reviewer isn't understanding it, and I want to explain it here, and this is why this reviewer I think is wrong. Would you mind sending it to a third reviewer? This is where the editor will use their discretion. If they say no to you, sometimes the editor will say no, and then the angry email will get angrier. But the editor is making a decision. The editor has read the piece. At that moment, when you ask for a third reviewer and say these reviewers don't know what they're talking about, the editor sits down and reads the entire article. And if they agree with the reviewers, they're going to say no to a third reviewer. That means your article's done. And it just needs to go somewhere else, or you need to kind of rethink it. Demanding or getting angry at that moment is undermining the editor, because then it's not about the reviewers anymore. It's about the editorial decision. Now, most editors want to publish work. They want to publish good work. For the journals that I work for, we want, maybe not more than anything, but we very much want to ensure that the expertise from Georgia, the expertise from the region, or from Armenia, from Ukraine, or whatever, gets published, because that expertise is just extraordinarily, just scientifically, so much, it just adds so much valuable conversation, because, of course, as Westerners, as an American, there are things that I just will not see that Georgians will know, that I just don't have access to. And so there is a desire to publish broadly from authors in the region. So the editors in all these journals, also they're in the ones that I work for, are very passionate about the region. I'm thinking of all of my editors, it's like so Harris and Dima and the rest. All of us, the team wants that trajectory to occur. And in a nonpartisan way, I'm trying to think, but fairly nonpartisan way, very open. So the editors want to publish. And I think that is often undermined in the review process, because it seems so adversarial, and it seems so competitive, and it seems so critical. But the editors want very much to publish. So when the editor makes a call, the editor is often the softest person in the room. The editor is the one, if they send it out for review, they've already said, I think this could be published in the journal. And the reviewers and the associate editors are actually the harder people, and the editor-in-chief is the softer person. So if the editor-in-chief says, no, we're done here, you haven't won over the softest person in the room, which means you cut your losses and you go somewhere else. But never, ever abuse the editor. And that's all I have, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. And for those of you, I think there's only one left on the call. I'm happy to take any questions from the Zoom room as well. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this useful and helpful information. I had this one question. So it seems that journals have this possibility to get very useful and lots of data. For example, what kind of articles come, for example, post-Soviet countries, right? So can this data be base for the sociological research, for example? And you may have some information and experience for that, right?
That's a good question. So different journals will have different tendencies, and the tendencies might go like this. So if it does a lot of statistical work, if it's an economics journal or a political science journal or sociological journal, some journals require that the authors submit their data with their article. And that is for other authors to replicate the work. And to replicate the work means to get the data, the same data, use your own modeling technique to then check to see if the data are, that the findings are robust. Many journals, not many, some journals will keep those data and have them available for other authors to request. And they might be free upon request. That's one way to do it. The journals that I have relationships with, we don't require the data, in part because we don't have a lot of statistics going through our stuff. So there's no repository for the data work. You can always email the author. Depending on where the author is, there may be more or less of a norm of sharing data, but the farther west you go, the more the norm is to share all the data. And so the author would need to make you an argument as to why they're not ready to share their data. Some authors kind of, especially if they're gathering data in a particular way, like for example, I gathered, the data that I gather are very hard fought. Like I have to fight for my data. And it takes me a really long time to compile my data. And so I might kind of hold my data hostage for a bit until I get all of my publishing done with it. And then if someone asked me for my data, then I would send them my data. But the norm in the US and the norm in Western Europe is to share data. So you could, it may not be available through the journal, but probably you could email the author and request the data, and they would feel compelled to give you the data, or they would give you a reason as to why they can't. You're welcome.
Okay, well, so imagine that you have just written an article, and can you take us through the process of how you would think about where you would send it to, and like what the strategy would be? And are you already thinking about that even before you begin the article, or as you're writing it? Do you target the highest prestige journal first? Are you know, what is your sort of strategy for trying to get it in the right place, and how do you, what is your sort of thought process as you're going through that process?
Are you asking me for me, or are you asking what I tell my students?
Maybe both.
Maybe both. Okay. So I'll tell you what I tell my students, and I'll tell you what I do. My students are an ambitious bunch. My students learn a whole bunch of theory, and they go to seminars, and they criticize everybody, and everybody's an idiot, right? Like the graduate seminar, there's nobody more critical than a graduate student. And they have these visions of getting into the best possible journal, the ones with the 16% acceptance rate. I did the same thing. and I got rejected from all of them, which might say more about me than my students. But my advice is always for my students to aim low, especially on the first article, because you're going to screw it up along the way. Like it's a new, you learn, it's a skill, it's a learned skill. It's actually like a mathematical formula. Like the more you do it, the easier it becomes. So the hardest one to do is your first one. And that's when you learn the process and you're learning the thing and it's all coming together. And you're also learning how to deal with the criticism. Because if you've had soft criticism before, now it's hard criticism and no one cares about your psyche and no one cares about how you feel, and some people are actually trying to harm you because they don't want to compete with you. So it's a heavy world there, and so for students I would aim for something like a gentle journal. Like a Caucasus Survey is a lovely journal. Problems of Postcommunism is a lovely journal. Like all of course the ones that I work for are fabulous. But I would aim lower. I would aim more empirical as opposed to the journals that require a theoretical brilliance. Because the other thing is it's very unlikely that a new student in any field has the capacity to change it theoretically. It's really hard to do that. And so it's something that typically your seasoned people who've been a PhD a little bit longer are able to do. So you're just more likely to get the publication and the experience with lower level journals. So that's what I tell my students. And they always ignore me. Always. They have always ignored me and sent it to the top journal and then got rejected. And then like after about 3 rejections, then they get it to where it is, where it needs to be, and it gets, they get the criticism and then they change it. And so that's also a learning process for them, but it takes them about a year longer than they ever wanted to get published, which is a step. It's not efficient. For me now, I write with specific journals in mind. So I've got a piece I'm working on now that has a little bit of a theoretical punch to it. I sent it to Comparative Politics. It got rejected. So I'm unlikely to keep it in that theoretical zone. I'm going to move it into a much more empirical outlet. But it was something that, like, I sent it to some friends, editor friends, and they were like, this has a theoretical, it's got this gloss to it that could have a theoretical importance. So aim higher. In the end, it didn't work for that particular journal, but that's okay. So that one was my risk one. So I've got ones I'm like, okay, this might have something. I'm going to try to send it up. Others, I've got another piece I'm working on identity construction and understanding, kind of in Georgia, and it's less. It's an applied piece. So I'm working with different theories and trying to see how it works in Georgia in particular trajectories. But it's going into a much more regional-oriented journal. I pay attention to my method. I do qualitative work and then I do statistical work. Anything that's quantitative, statistical, it's got to go to a journal where they can find reviewers for it. I've got a project that I've been working on for like ever on networks, social networks in Georgia, and political impacts or their effects on political trajectories here. And that's a mixed method piece, so it combines stats and this weird methodology of social network analysis with interview work, and so that's kind of a crossover piece. And so that's going to have a very particular audience, and so I have to send it to a journal with that in mind. So now, absolutely, every project that I have, every research question I have, I think to myself, what are the 3 journals? What's my reach journal? What's my likely journal? And then where am I willing to let it go if it all goes to hell? And then where is it gonna go? I also can't publish so much in the journals that I edit. So that's me being on so many boards and being associate editor actually limits the number of journals that I can send my stuff to, because I know the editorial team and it doesn't look as good. They're like, of course she can publish a nationalities paper. She's a special issues editor, and you don't want that either. I mean, you want your work to to be vetted. You want it to make sure it gets an honest look, and it's harder to do that if you have too close a connection with any particular journal. So that's always on my mind as well, but that's very specific to me.
And just two follow-up questions to
Sure.
that. The first one is, do you ever begin with publishing in a particular journal as the goal? Or is it begin always with the project in the article? And the second question would be, if you have this three journals in mind in a sort of a hierarchy of which would be preferable, do you have a specific order or strategy if it does get rejected say if it gets rejected in one journal, would you always go down, or would you sometimes try to shoot up?
Laterally. Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think it depends on our trajectory as academics in our careers. So I'm associate professor, and to get to full professor, I have to have a particular I have to have a particular publication record, but I also have to build a reputation in the field, and I have to be known by my peers in particular ways. So a few years ago, I wrote an article on Georgian elections and electoral fraud and some other things in Georgian elections, especially in minority regions. But in order to look at the minority regions, I actually had to look at broader Georgian elections to compare. It was very statistical. And I always knew that was going to go to a non-regional journal, and it was going to go to a general journal. So a topical journal. So I sent it to electoral studies. Like I set out when I wrote that piece, this is for electoral studies. I wrote it for electoral studies. And I wanted to have it done in electoral studies because I wanted to be able to get published talking about a topic of which Georgia was an example. So it's not about Georgia, but Georgia is an example of how in semi-authoritarian regimes elections can actually work to build constituencies, or where they fail to build constituencies, and how that might work in those settings. So there, Georgia just happened to be the topic. I mean, it didn't happen to be the topic. My expertise is on Georgia politics, but I decided I wanted to do that because I wanted to show the committee that was going to consider my file for promotion that they would understand that my ability to speak to a scholarly audience was bigger than just to people in Georgia or to people in the former communist region or this part of Europe, but rather that would go into a journal that writes about American politics and Canadian politics. Anywhere that there are elections, electoral studies hit. So I wanted to have that general studies hit. So in that sense, I look at where they are on the hierarchy, where they are with my methodology. It was very hard for them to find reviewers because no one who does statistics knows Georgia well, at least not at that time. Now there's always Dustin or Koba or somebody, but then they know me. And I've already presented it at Works in Progress at CRC. So it took a while to find reviewers for that piece. So that's the danger. So I think that answered question number one. Question number two, so I wrote this piece for comparative politics, and do I go down with it, or do it depends on my fix. So I got really good feedback, and the feedback was absolutely correct. When I got it, I was like, oh, this is wrong, they're terrible. And then I read it about 6 times, as I told you guys my practice, and then I realized that they're absolutely right. The piece it didn't fit together well, and I can package it better, and I can see where it's going to go. So I'm going to revise it. And depending how confident I am in that revision, and whether or not I think that the paper is now much better, I might send it to a journal up or a journal lateral as opposed to a journal down. The problem is the other problem with journals is that there's a word count limit, and there's a word count limit, and there's also a graphics limit. So some of the journals, since I do a lot of statistical work, like a full-page graphic, I'm required to deduct 1,000 words from my output. So I might have it's a 10,000 word a piece, but I might have 5 graphs. And that means I can only have 5,000 words. And so some of the journals are really punitive for statistical output. And so that affects, for this particular article, that affects my thinking. Like I'm looking at what's the word count, how many graphics I'm allowed, whether the graphics take away from my word count. Those sorts of restrictions actually narrow the pool quite dramatically in ways that I had not expected when I started. There's the methodological, the high quant ones are really punitive. They have really short word counts. So anyone who wants to do interviews or anyone who wants to do really thick qualitative work can't get their stuff there. And then the qual places who have the longer word counts, they really punish graphics. So it's very hard to be mixed method in this field. In political science, at least, it's very hard to be mixed method, which is exactly kind of where I find myself. And that restricts the number of journals that I can apply, that I can send my stuff to.
Well, so according to your experience, when do you think that, so to say, is the best time for the write an article for the first time? I mean, after master degree, for example, or maybe?
Question. So when's the best time? So there are three things you need to have completed in your scholarly career. Mm-hmm. I don't have an answer for master's degree, PhD. I don't have an answer for that. I have a substantive answer.
Okay.
You need to know the theory well enough that you know where the debates are in the field. And it could be from your coursework in a master's or PhD program that you don't get the full theory. Mm-hmm. You may get training on how to interact with the theory. So you may go to a classroom and they'll say, well, these theories are combating these theories are combating these theories. And you need to be able to know whether there are more theories and how to access that other theoretical framework. Oftentimes, at least in the graduate programs where I teach, so I teach PhD students, I teach master's students, and I teach undergraduates. So my master's, I have some master's and PhD students in a kind of similar theoretical classroom. I can only show them in 14 weeks. I can only show them really a very shallow understanding of a lot of different theories. To write a good journal article, you need a deeper understanding of those theories. So it's the student who is more seasoned, who has been through more of those, who is aware of their gaps in knowledge. Sometimes graduate seminars, there's so much information, and there's so much new information for the student. The student misunderstands the information that they're getting and thinks that they're getting a lot of information. Whereas from our perspective, they're actually getting quite little information. The more a student is aware of that difference, the more they're ready to publish. So if you know, so you know best where you are on that trajectory. Because the more we study anything, the more we realize the less we know. Yeah. And if you're realizing how little you know as opposed to how much you know, then you're ready to publish. That's how you know, theoretically. Empirically, now that's something you don't, I mean, you need your theory to match your empirical work. And then there's your methodology. So empirically, if you have a source of data, you can get that data as a master's student, you can get it as an undergraduate, right? You can, that is something that you can always be cultivating, this expertise on this knowledge and this specific knowledge that you're always thinking about, that you're always working on. That is something, this is something that is gestating, right? Like you have it in your hand and you can only get it to work if it matches this theory. So the moment you can get them together is when you're ready to publish. And then the third factor is methodology. If you're using a qualitative methodology, it's not something you have to learn and master. The more specialized the methodology you need, then it might be a while, because then you have to learn that technique, whatever it is. So I'm doing a study, my social network analysis study. I had to learn the technique. And it's crazy, like it's crazy. And so now I have a co-author who actually has mastered it, and I have to understand it because I'm the packager, and I'm the one I've got the data, and I have the Georgia knowledge, and I have the theory, and then I have this mathematician, but she just produces the math, and I've got to make sense of it, so I have to know the method well enough. But the method took me like 3 years even to know generally, you know, because it's so huge. So depending on your methodology, that's also a limitation. So the easiest thing to get is the data. Like my students are bursting with data, and they're like, but they have no path for that publication because they don't know how to package it and they don't know where to put it. So that theoretical gap is important. They don't see it. They don't see the theoretical gap. They only see the methodological gap, but they don't see the theoretical gap. So I think that theoretical distance is the hardest thing to know, but the moment you know it, then you're ready to publish.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, we have a question from the Facebook Live, from Ia Kupatadze, who asks, says, thank you for the interesting presentation. Any suggestions for an architect who is more a practitioner than a writer? Journals that could be more appropriate, that see more articles written by architects?
This is a good question. The architecture is obviously not my field, and certainly there are articles. I mean, certainly there are journals on architecture. So I'm not going to be able to give you specific advice on that. So I presume you have expertise and understanding of specific architectural journals where you would do your stuff, and maybe you're asking this question because you don't necessarily see a fit into your own world. Where I have seen fits of architecturally minded things are like urban planning or development sort of articles that come in the social sciences. They come in and kind of like kind of critical geography sort of things, or the planning of cityscapes, or the how buildings fit into the sociological or cultural experience or anthropological even experience of a particular place. And we've seen things like that in nationalities papers. We've seen it. It's often been with regard to kind of a cultural heritage sort of thing, or a politics of memory sort of thing, where buildings are constructed to reflect a particular identity. We'll see that in nationalities papers, and importantly in the Association for the Study of Nationalities, which is the scholarly organization that publishes nationalities papers. My advice actually is to whatever discipline you're in. So I got to apologize to this person in architecture, because the answer is I don't know the answer to your question. And I'm struggling to try to find something that I can answer. So my advice is generally, you want to, first, when you write a piece, you want to take it to a conference and share it. And not a small internal conference like Ilia State Conference, no. You want to take it to a broad scholarly convention where your work has an outlet. And once you're on a panel and your piece is in that panel, then whoever you're on that panel with, whoever's reading your stuff, these are your colleagues, these are your peers. They know where you want to publish your stuff. And if that conference has a journal, then chances are at that convention, I know that we do this at ASN, we have a panel on publishing, like how to publish your work. And that's where you ask this question, like, is this journal a good outlet for my work? And they'll say, yes, this is right, or absolutely not, this is entirely the wrong place. And then you say, okay, where do you think this is best published? And so whoever is in that convention, if you're with people who are talking about the things that you're talking about and answering the questions that you're asking in your own work, then they will know who their peers are. They will know what those journals are. If it's not the journal that's associated with the convention, then they'll know where that work gets published. Another place to look is, so when you write an article, right, you have your research question that you're seeking to answer. There's a theoretical debate, and then there's empirical findings. or there's a methodological debate and then there are empirical findings, or there's an analytical debate or an analysis trajectory that you take and then apply to your empirical findings. So even in non-theoretical journals, like even if it's a policy relevant journal, there is some sort of analytical anchor that empirical work kind of clings to. Whoever you're citing for that analytical anchor, you want to read more of that stuff and find the journals where they publish their work. And that should give you insight into which journals your stuff will land. So even if you're not like looking at these broad theoretical things, there has to be a way to interpret something. There has to be something like, this thing that I see here, I am going to interpret it, and it means this. And there's going to be advice on what the this is and how to find the this. Like, so you can either interpret it in X fashion or in Y fashion. These people do X, these people do Y. Those people are the people that are publishing where you want your stuff to go. And that's how you find that. You find those analytical anchors, whatever those anchors happen to be. If you don't have analytical anchors and you only have empirics, it doesn't matter, like the discipline. Every single discipline is going to have some kind of theoretical anchor or analytical anchor, because that's how we make sense of the noise of the data points. Is we look at trend lines, we look at conglomerations or clumps of them, and some scholars will say this clump is more important than that clump. But it's whoever aggregates those interpretations, that's the analytical source. And it's where those are, where you find those, is where you want to send your work. So I always do a kind of citation chase of my own work to say, okay, where could this go? Where are these analytical touchstones that help me interpret this sort of thing? If you don't have them, probably they're out there. You just haven't found them yet.
I think even more simply, sometimes I just think about where are the articles that I really like, or where are the articles that inspire me, and think I want to publish them in those journals.
That's also a good strategy.
Got more questions, Nino? We did promise to talk about reviewer 2. So I'll tell you my theory. So my theory is that, especially in the past, before much of the submission process was automated, and now it's, for many journals, it goes through sort of online interfaces that determine who goes where and in what order. For example, the commentary is given back to the author. Although some journals are still old-fashioned, some editors, I think, still use cut and paste. My theory is that there's a human tendency to give good news first and bad news last. So they would give the better review first, that's reviewer 1, and then they would give you the really nasty feedback secondly.
And then it's up to the editor to decide.
And basically, that's my theory anyway, of why reviewer 2 gets the reputation as being the nasty one.
It's an interesting hypothesis. And I don't think it could work in today's systems where they're automated, where they're all computerized. I mean, I can see it, I mean, when it was in paper, I mean, physical paper, but this is way, way back. I mean, like, even comparative politics is modernized now, and that's one of the last. So for the last, I guess, probably 15 years, most things run through Manuscript Central. Now, Caucasus survey just got automated before it went to the... Well, this is my experience. And not to say that you're wrong, Tim, but I suspect that your hypothesis is not confirmed by my experience. When I get a paper, the first person I send it out to is the person I think has the most expertise on the subject. So the first reviewer is the most obvious reviewer. And so I will look for the best expert on that topic. And that's reviewer 1. If they accept, which they often won't. And then for reviewer 2, and other, like, this is my practice. Reviewer 2 is the reach reviewer. And And it means they're going to be differently critical than reviewer one, I think, because reviewer two often doesn't have a precise expertise. They're not the obvious person. They may be someone who understands the method, or they understand the question but not the region. And so often reviewer two is a little bit more distance from the topic. For me, my reviewer one is the expert in the field. And if that reviewer is not of the region, reviewer two, I try to get someone from the region who kind of works on that kind of thing. But it's more important for me to get someone from the region who has local knowledge. And so I'll let that stretch a little bit. But I've also noted that reviewers from the region are much meaner than non-regional reviewers. Like there's something just... maybe it's because people are writing in a foreign language. It's easier to be mean in a foreign language, and so English is not a native language, and so they feel free to let it fly a bit. But I've noticed that the reviews, I get them back, and they're just, whoa, I'm like, okay, let's soften this. What do I write in my response to kind of make this go a little bit? So it depends, but I actually think it's often an accident as well, because these days I might go through 12 reviewers before I get 2 people who are accepting, and by that time, who reviewer 1 is and reviewer 2 is, it's so far beyond anything that I have knowledge of. But to be fair, for communist, post-communist studies, I am their Caucasus editor, so I get everything on the Caucasus, and sometimes I get Ukraine and Moldova. Because it just depends on what the other editors have on their table. But I get, my stuff is typically the Caucasus. And so there I can be fairly selective around like my network and people who write on it, because I know that well. For nationalities papers, I'm special issues editor, which means I get stuff that I have no expertise on at all. Like, so right now we have something under review about Western European federalization and elites, and so I've got to find a scholar of Belgium, Belgian regions, like not just Belgium, like Belgium regions or Scotland or something. I've been doing Scotland, Belgium, and Ethiopia, and so for that, Google Scholar is my friend, and I try to find people. I mean, like it's actually quite hard to find reviewers, and it's horrible. Like I'll find someone on Google Scholar, I'll be like, yes, I found somebody, it's perfect, and then they last published in 2007. I'm like, oh no, and then they're dead, and so then I have to redo it. Like, so it's actually not as scientific as you might think. It's more just begging people who will review for me. And then in a pinch, you can always ask someone on the editorial board. But I think reviewer 2, I don't even bother with like putting, like just mechanically in the system, there is no way to order the output. Like it just, there is a reviewer 1, like there's the first reviewer you find, and if they accept, great. And then you get the piece. I'll just describe it to you. You get the piece, and you know who the author is, I think. I don't remember. I don't pay attention to who the author is. Like, I don't want to know. And then you read it, you kind of look it over, you make sure it's not desk reject. A desk reject is it just doesn't fit. It's not, it's not going to get published. There's just no way it's going to be in the journal. So you make a decision on desk reject. Then you, okay, so let's say it makes it through the desk reject process. Then you read it again. And then you're really thinking like, who could evaluate this? And sometimes the people, and then you also look to see who has reviewed recently for the journal. So there are some people who just they say yes. And you don't want to kill those people. So so I can see like the statistics. It'll say when was the last time, how many times have they reviewed this year for the journal, or how many times have they reviewed this year in all of the journals that are carried by that particular conglomeration of the computer system. And so if I can see that they've reviewed in the past but not recently, like that's a reviewer that's golden, because you know they review. Like, because some people just say no to everything, but you know they've said yes before, but not in a while. And so then then I would send it to them, because I know that they're kind of vetted and in the system. The other thing is, if I have a piece that I think is perfectly within the skill set of someone I know well, I will send it to them, and then I will send them a message on Facebook. And I will say, I have this piece. It is perfect for you. Please accept it. Please say you'll do the review. And I don't abuse that too much, but sometimes it's really, really hard to find somebody. And if I know this person and they're a personal friend, I'll say, hey, it's a good piece. Like, give it a look, give it a strong look, and see what you see. Not to change the outcome, but then those people, if they're a reviewer too, they're just going to be nicer, because it's not just a review; it's also a favor. Sorry, Tim. It's just, and then when they come, like, so the reviews come, like I can see the review, it'll say this person did this and this person evaluated this way, and then I can read the review. And then once both reviews are in, like the system creates the letter. So I don't structure the letter. I just have a little box, and I send a message to my editor, to the editor-in-chief of the journal, and I'll say something like, I think that the author should pay a lot of attention. And I don't know if I'm the only, like there are some practices that I do that I think are unusual in the journal, and then others are kind of normal in the journal. But I'll give some advice. And I can see in the letter that the editors generate that they literally just copy paste my thing in. Like no one has time to order the pieces. It's too much work. Like we're like, okay, whatever reviewer two said, like they can be jerks, and I try to soften it, and kind of give that trajectory, but I'm not sure all the other associate editors do that. But yeah, no, I think that I think probably I think there's a lot of self-selection bias in that self-reporting of reviewer two, and we only notice it if it is reviewer two, and rarely do we notice it if it's reviewer one. I will say that my most recent article rejection, it was reviewer one that was harder, and reviewer two is like, it's great, just not good enough, but I really want you to work on it. I could tell that reviewer two was worried about me and like wanted me to be like feel okay. Like I really appreciated reviewer two, but I think we just observed it when it's reviewer two. But I think it's also just like when you're reading a piece, it's like, oh, I know who can review that. It's so and so. And I'll send it to them, and then you're like, okay, who else can review this? So I don't know, or maybe this person, I don't know, maybe this person. And so there's more of it's harder to find reviewer two. And that might also be, we don't have that network connection, and maybe that might predispose them to be meaner. I could see that as an explanation.
I think the reviewer two Facebook group is clear to make the point that reviewer two is a mindset. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, anybody can be a reviewer too. It doesn't actually have to be.
Well, everyone is a reviewer. I mean, no one knows where they are. I mean, it's not like reviewer one. We don't say, you are reviewer one, you are reviewer two. It's more like, will you please, we beg you, please take the time and send it to me in a month. Will you please do this? That's when you get but yeah, reviewer one and reviewer two don't know where they are on that reviewer structure.
So I think we are just about out of time. Are there any more questions from the audience or anywhere else? So if not, then on behalf of Ilia State University, we thank you very much, and thank our participants, and wish everybody good luck and best of luck with their next submission and in dealing with reviewer two, whoever that reviewer should actually be.